Dean Spade. Welcome back to Love in a Fucked Up World, where we talk about how to build and sustain strong connections, because our resistance movements are made of our relationships and are only as strong as they are. Before I dive into this new episode, I want to let you know about something we're working on that I'm very excited about. About a year ago, I got a critical and thoughtful letter from an imprisoned reader, Corey, who I met through study and struggle. Corey shared how much he wished that my book, Love in a Fucked Up World, had actually directly addressed the obstacles people face when having relationships across prison walls. It inspired me to make a new kind of episode where I recorded a bunch of different interviews with people who have worked through relationship struggles across prison walls, and including people who've had their relationships transition when somebody gets out. I started doing these interviews, and of course soon I had so much material that we're actually making 2 episodes, and the episodes are a bit different than usual because instead of being one interview, it's kind of more like a documentary movie where we're editing together interviews with lots of different people. Hope and Kelsey have been working on this very intensively with me, and we'll be releasing some of the longer footage that won't make it into the episodes on our Patreon in the coming months for people who want to go deeper with this. I'm so excited that we're going to be able to share the first of these 2 episodes about relating across the prison walls before we go on our summer break. I actually think there's not enough out there for people to talk through the really specific stressors that are added to relationships where somebody's locked up and where the prison system is controlling people's communications in very particular, really awful, inhumane ways. And so I'm hopeful that this will be a really good resource for everybody who is in those relationships and also help inspire more people to become friends and pen pals with people who are inside. I want to invite everybody to join the Patreon at patreon.com/DeanSpade. You can choose free or paid memberships. There's a lot of cute stuff going on there. And I want to give really huge thanks to people who are already our paid Patreon members. Our podcast has been out for almost an entire year, and it's a huge effort and so fun and satisfying. We love making it, and Patreon members are what makes it possible. We have no ads, and your support on Patreon allows us to keep building and releasing new episodes. So now for today's episode, it was recorded live in an event organized by the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies, which some of us call CLAGS, at the City University of New York, also called CUNY. CLAGS is an organization very near and dear to my heart. The public conversations organized by CLAGS about queer liberation and HIV/AIDS helped shape my politics starting in the 1990s. When I was a board member of CLAGS in the early 2000s, I just have always been a huge fan. There's sort of nothing like CLAGS in terms of its existence at a public university that is also a site of long-term historical struggle, putting out ideas that are about queer and trans radical resistance. So it was a delight to be invited to collaborate with CLAGS on this event. And you can see the whole video on our YouTube or CLAGS YouTube. And you might want to check out that video because it has ASL interpretation, which is not included in this edited conversation. So when CLAGS asked me who I'd like to invite to a conversation marking Trans Day visibility, I did not hesitate to name my heart's desire, Vicky Osterweil, whose work has been so influential to me and who, as you'll hear in our conversation, I consider an oracle and an answer key. Vicky's 2022 book, In Defense of Looting, is something I teach every year. It's a book I turn back to regularly for inspiration in these very hard times, and probably the single book I most often recommend that other people read. And now Vicky has a wonderful new book just released this month called The Extended Universe: How Disney Killed the Movies and Took Over the World. I was reading an advanced copy of this book all this fall, and I learned so much from it. I was so excited to get to talk to Vicky about it during this conversation. This event is also our first live recording of an episode of my podcast, Love in a Fucked Up World. And so I'm really excited to get to do the podcast with a live audience and get to answer questions in the moment. And thanks to everybody for being part of this collaborative experiment. And especially thank you, Vicky, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's really great to be here. I'm a big fan of the podcast. So yeah, just excited to be here with you and overwhelmed by the praise that is a reflection of, I think just also being part of movement and listening and just reflecting back to people what they've already learned and taught me. So thank you so much. And that goes for you as well. Much of your work is similarly reflected. So thank you.
Thank you. Because I'm obsessed with your book, In Defense of Looting, and it feels so deeply relevant to the times, I wondered if we might start our discussion there. I think of the thesis in Defense of Looting and also the specific chapters so frequently. Obviously, today is March 31st. We've just passed a weekend of No Kings events where there's a really, strong public narrative through those protests coming from political officials and other speakers, often calling for law and order, calling for us to be a nation of laws and fighting back against Trump's fascism. and encouraging people to be law abiding. And I heard the word decency a lot in the speeches that I heard recorded. So that kind of conversation about how we resist is a very dominant one in this time in which more people are actually considering engaging in resistance. And I wondered if we might talk about that a bit, if you would be willing to reflect on, yeah, on how the thesis of indefensive looting relates to some of the kinds of developments we're seeing in terms of the increase in law enforcement, in particular immigration enforcement in the US, increasing resistance to that, increasing mutual aid efforts, and these discourses about nonviolence and pacifism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, simultaneous to those events happening, I think maybe literally to the hour, but probably, I think with the time difference a little bit off, the Israeli Knesset was passing a law making it legal for them to execute Palestinians in their power, explicitly Palestinians, right? So, I mean, that's legal now. That's terrifying. And I'm sorry to start on that kind of a note when we're talking about resistance, but I think it is illustrative. Similarly, today on Trans Day Visibility, the Supreme Court here in the US, as people probably know, set down a ruling making it legal to do conversion therapy. Much of what Trump does has been legal, obviously, and some of it hasn't been. And those distinctions, I think, are increasingly, obviously to everyone, not meaningful because it's what he can do. It's illegal for him to declare a war. So he just like barely remembers to call the events in Iran a military, whatever mission, whatever the word is. And he can't even hold it together for a variety of reasons that we all are forced to know about him and his psyche. But I think like the fundamental thesis of the book, for folks who haven't read it, is that looting and property destruction and rioting has been a crucial part of liberation movements in America and in the world through the whole duration of capitalism. And it is explicitly an anti-police, anti-white supremacist tactic when it is deployed, particularly in uprisings for racial liberation, not every single time it occurs. And then sort of, I think the concomitant argument that's being made is that the political action that really changes the world is usually, not always, that changes the world for the better, that changes the world toward in liberatory directions, is how I want to say this, tends to come from crowds of people moving, operating with either passive or active disregard and disdain for the law and the limits of what is possible according to a polite society, and in the name of an ethical and liberatory framework of, I don't know, freedom for sexual expression, bodily autonomy, the abolition of whiteness, of police, of prisons and property. And so when I look at sort of No Kings, and I think for those of you who are still on one or the other horribly, terminally online social media sites, I think we had an argument this time that we see a lot, but I think there's been a lot more engagement from a certain segment of the sort of radical left who's usually not that interested in this kind of things, and sort of arguing we should be there, we should be recruiting, we should be sort of like pushing, mutual aid organizations at these marches. And then you have other people saying, these marches are recuperative, they're pretty meaningless, it's the spectacle that happens like once every, few months. And I think that under the conditions we're in right now, this is a classic social media conflict because both sides are right. Their argument is right, but insufficient. So you can argue that forever, right? Because you can stay really, really hard. Yes, if millions of people are going to be in the street talking about how they hate Trump, and it is your inclination to try and radicalize those people, that's probably a good way to do it. That's not a bad, you're not wrong that that's possible. And if the No Kings and these organizations are at the forefront of what we would call resistance, then we're in a lot of trouble. Precisely for the reasons that you say, which is that they're interested in law and order, they're interested in elections, they're interested in, proper modes of behavior, and these forms of resistance that are very contained. This is not necessarily, this is anecdata, obviously, but like family members of mine, bio-family members of mine, who 3 years ago would have pushed back at me on this. A few of them who went to No Kings reported they were frustrated by how much election talk there was. So there is a shift happening, but I think that shift is happening precisely because of the extremity of Trump's unpopularity, how obviously fascistic they're being. I think there's many ways in which, now I'm sort of off topic, but yeah, I think that's the connection of the thesis, and we can get into the nitty gritty of that as we move on.
Yeah, I really appreciate this. I think one of the things that's really visible to me about it is that there's actually a really intense pedagogy and disciplinary process by saying like everybody needs to be really decent, everybody needs to be really law abiding. We're showing them that we're, like, and it really goes hand in hand. I mean, I was just listening to like the speeches that were excerpted on Democracy Now! From Minneapolis, and you've got like Congress people and various celebrities saying like, we're a nation of laws and this isn't what America's like. And it's just
Yeah.
like, there's a kind of deep like patriotism and commitment to liberalism that tells people that the main event is elections. And I think this goes hand in hand with this other thing I've been hearing that I would just love to hear you talk about, where people are like, well, we can't mutual aid our way out of this. It's nice what happened in Minneapolis, but we need to get, and what they never say underneath there is get back to focusing on the Democratic Party, everybody. And I would love to just like hear your counter offers to the kind of like, we need to be well behaved. We need to embrace America as, the fantasy of America as a place where there's democracy and civil something. And the idea that we could never have enough like autonomous care and resistance to mean anything if we don't go through the state.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm also really frustrated by we can't mutual aid our way out of this problem, precisely because that's a really bad faith argument, right? Because like what the people who are doing the mutual aid are doing is often saying, we are supporting all of this other kind of political activity. And like when you do really important mutual aid, and if you see what's happening in Minneapolis, you tend to focus on a certain block, a certain neighborhood, providing a certain kind of service or good. That's how, you're good at online fundraising. Great. That's what you do. You're good at Ice Watch. Great. That's what you do. You're good at making big batches of food for people doing Ice Watch in the cold. Great. That's what you do. And like, of course, we're all, individuals in this way where we can only do as much as we have effort for. But I think it is truly fascinating to look at Minneapolis, where mutual aid actually defeated a federal invasion. And this is not to downplay how horrible things have been in Minneapolis and how desperate things are now, especially because they now have to pay rent after people have had to hide inside for 3 months. And like that has been the struggle. And if you have some extra money, buy a trans girl a pizza today in honor of Mira Bellwether, but also give some money to Minneapolis rent defense funds if you can. Just a shout out for those. But anyway, I think what those people are sort of reaching for is like, we are tired of trying to imagine a new way to do this. And like, I mean, I think that Minneapolis, frankly, is like on par with what we saw in 1905 in Russia with the creation of Soviets. Soviets just meant councils. It was just workers' councils. I think it's on par with some of the experiments we saw during Reconstruction here in the United States. There are really tremendous shifts in what is possible, in what is normalized, in what social means, in what neighbor means, in what protecting each other means, and in what living a good life means, right? These really, really crucial things are being redefined and rethought through by people on the street. And I think what's so beautiful, one of the things I really love about Minneapolis, and that I think is really anathema to the kind of No Kings folks, and why they don't like it, is because no one can tell you how many organizations did that in Minneapolis. No one has any idea. People would learn about organizations that were a block away, because they could be as informal as a signal chat between neighbors, right? And there's a lot of redundancy in the process. And what the state offers in theory, and sometimes in practice, is a certain kind of efficiency. It's efficient at being able to control the cost of a thing. It is efficient at being able to determine who gets help, but it's much better at determining who doesn't, right? It's much better at exclusion than at determining who gets help. It's much better at excluding people from the body politic, from the society, making people disposable or available to premature death. All of which is to say, I think what a lot of people want to see a big political change, a revolution that looks like something like the stuff that we saw in the 20th century. Despite the fact that for all of the incredible gains and lessons that were learned in the 20th century, none of those led to a truly egalitarian society. And the things that did were experimental and were crushed, right? Either by imperialist forces or by internal counter-revolutionary enemies, whichever one you want to look at and talk about. All of which is to say, the sense that it is really desperate for the No Kings leadership. I think this is decreasingly true for the folks in the crowd, but I think it's increasingly like desperate on the part of the leadership and the folks who run those sort of nonprofits and the democratic funnel organizations to insist that what politics looks like is no kings, because we actually saw real power in Minneapolis, and it was totally invisible to nonprofits in some ways. It was totally invisible to people outside the process themselves. It was redundant, it was voluntary, it was messy, and that means there is no control, there was no visibility, and there's no way to profit off of it. And there's no way to guarantee that you're going to get the outcome you want when you're sitting at the top of a nonprofit or a political party or what have you. And ultimately, it threatens property relations in general, right? Because I think like what you're looking at now in Minneapolis, the reason I started here, and I apologize, I do tend to ramble and go on silence. Please cut me off if I do, but is that what we're looking at now is now they have to solve this problem of rent, right? So, I mean, obviously that's extremely stressful and difficult. It's also radicalizing, right? Is the realization like, oh, the reason we can't live like this is rent. Like, that's not a thing that's easy to actually conceptualize. I mean, you can argue it till the cows come home, and you and I both have. And then like talk about the way that property and rent and expense and reflexively we sort of know it. Like most of us tend to know, if it weren't for rent, I would quit this job. If it weren't for rent, I would not live with this partner, right? Or this roommate who I hate. If it was not for rent, I wouldn't live in this neighborhood. I wouldn't live in this city. I wouldn't live at home with my parents, right? Whatever it is, we know that massive choices about our lives are being made constantly by these basic material needs. But when you witness an entire city do something heroic and genuinely small t democratic and like revolutionary together, and the thing that they come up against isn't the police. Like ICE, I mean, they're still there. Things are still bad. I want to be really clear. I do not want to oversell the victory. But what the goals of the administration were, which was to get revenge for 2020, which kicked off in Minneapolis, was to demonstrate that they could put a city under the fascist boot, right? To create spectacular images of their own power at the expense of the people. They failed on those terms. And Minneapolis showed all of us a path against, a way to struggle against this. Not necessarily to win, and they haven't won permanently, but if you experience that and then you witness that the thing that means you can't keep going is rent, well then, okay, what we should do then, I guess, is get rid of landlords. We should have the houses for free. We should have housing. And of course, that immediately intersects with the unhoused struggle that's been going on. I think it forces you to think about how imprisonment works, like when people who are, being housed in prisons and jails, like that is actually, I think one way of thinking about the prison system and the prison industrial complex is as one of the largest forms of social security offered by any state in the world. The United States houses and feeds millions of people all the time in total, and gives them all of their services, all their medical services. Now, those are terrible services, and the food is awful, and the housing is as bad as it's possible. It's the worst possible version. But like, this is one way that the state offers care. And what we see in Minneapolis and in mutual aid is a different form of care that is actually interested in the people being able to say what they want, say what they need, and participate in taking care of one another. And for state and liberal alike, that is the scariest possible thing, because the fact is we don't need them, but they need us. We reproduce their world every day. If we didn't have rent, who knows what would be happening in Minneapolis?
I'm so glad you brought this up. I just got off the phone with one of our mutual friends who lives in Minneapolis, and she was talking about how there's a frustration right now there's so many new people who did mutual aid work and who did political work for the first time in the last few months, it's so beautiful. These moments where we see so many people participate who haven't before, because what we need, right? We need like everybody to get involved in taking care of each other and fighting back and building autonomous methods of survival in these very difficult times we're living in that are getting worse and worse. And she was saying there's a lot of frustration in the people doing this mutual aid work because they're desperately trying to raise money for this rent. And it's like, who wants to raise a bunch of money and give it to landlords? Like, yuck. And that, I feel like there's this obvious battle between those of us who are like, great, this leads to a more and more politicized struggle around housing, or people start to imagine really massive, rent strikes outside the rules. People started to imagine occupying spaces. People started to imagine like really attacking the property relations that make our basic necessities, as you were saying, completely controlled by our opponents. Or the other side, where people are like, how do we wrangle all these people into thinking just about the Democratic Party or about the next election, and have them think that they can never do this on their own? Mutual aid is too small and scrappy. We just need something, quote unquote, to scale. And that means we need to turn this into something the city council or the, state legislature will do. And that's really hard in the US context where liberalism has made most people not be able to imagine very much autonomy or occupation of space, where the private property relations are taken as so given, where we've been denied the stories like the ones that are in defense of looting, of what it looks like when huge numbers of people resist and break the law to do it and don't institutionalize, don't do it so that they can build an institution that will govern better. And this image that so many anarchists use about the sort of many-headed hydra, like how much more powerful it is when lots of people, as you were saying, have like a zillion organizations and groups and informal connections in the neighborhoods and across the city and across the region, instead of having, I think a lot of people, when they think about going to scale, they're like, it should all be under one roof and there should be a professionalized sort of staff and it should be the same in all places. This is the model of the state / also the NGO. When you do that, you can just you can either assassinate the leadership of that, or you can buy them off, or all the things we've seen a zillion times. And so to me, there's like a real battle going on about our imaginations of how transformation works and what a solution is to the kinds of problems we're living under, like ecocide and genocide. And to that end, because you are my oracle and answer key, whether or not you've consented to that role, I want to ask you the hardest question that I'm living with, which is, can people stop wars? All the wars I've been living through, I felt clear, even when there were the largest protests on earth multiple times while I've been alive, we couldn't stop. And it's clear that convincing elites that war and genocide are bad for people and other living things they know, they're okay with it. And I think there's a lot of exhaustion by people who are newly politicized since 2024. And there's so much change in public opinion about Palestine in the US, which is so amazing to see. And yet the on-the-ground policies are just worse and worse. And I just wondered, you have such a big view in my experience, that I find that so helpful. Your study of history. I've asked you many historical questions over time. I'm curious whether you can just tell me whether people can stop wars and all the fullness of that question.
Thank you for giving me the easy ones today. So, I mean, I have this sort of immediate cheeky, answer, which is we do everything, including wage the war and end the war, right? Whatever. Okay, fine. Cheap enough. But I'm actually not interested in that platitude. I actually think that the answer is yes, but it's not very satisfying when it happens, because the war is devastating and it doesn't happen cleanly, and it doesn't happen without the war having happened. Or so far, I mean, maybe it has. Maybe we actually have stopped wars. This is the thing about counterfactuals, right? About history, is we know about the wars that happened, but we don't know about what wars maybe someone wanted to wage, but they didn't have the social control in the state, and so they didn't do it, right? We don't know about what wars someone would have waged if they hadn't been, stopped by other action of the people, right? So on some level, it's unknowable because it's a sort of unfalsifiable question. Again, slightly less platitudinous, not satisfying as an answer. The answer that I would give that I feel the most qualified to is that people stopped Vietnam, but not in a way that saved Southeast Asia from the devastation that it faced, not in a way that really was as satisfying or morally clear as we would have hoped, and not the way the boomers like to tell the story, right? Which is that we did these protests and then they were good, and then at the DNC in '68 these damn radicals rioted on the street and then everything was lost. Whatever story it is that they're pushing, to the extent that they still do that. Hopefully y'all don't have to encounter that kind of argument anymore. I hope so. Please let that one die off at least. But what happened in Vietnam was that there was total collapse of the morale of the US military. So one of the things that happens in, I think, 71, please don't quote me on that, 72, is that Nixon turns to a strategy called Vietnamization. And what Vietnamization is a turn to air warfare. And they're we're going to let the South Vietnamese fight this war. We're just going to bomb. We're going to withdraw most of our ground troops, right? And the really intense ground fighting from US troops largely stops. They're drawn down very, very significantly. Now, part of the reason that happens is that, and this word still exists in US lexicons because of this, is there's a thing called fragging, which is named after a frag grenade, where soldiers were killing their officers rather than going out into the jungles on patrols, right? Now, those soldiers were draftees. Most of them were probably not particularly anti-war, although some of them might have been. They were certainly aware of the anti-war struggles happening back at home and against the myth-making, that comes straight from the Pau Mia flag people and the Rambo 2, where the vets are being spit on or whatever, as soon as they come home. A lot of vets were, their brothers and sisters were in the streets and they understood why, and they might not have been extremely opposed to the war, but they weren't really for it either, right? And so morale collapses, and there's a feedback loop there between the army being less and less successful. And so then you get like wins like the Tet Offensive in 1968, where the Viet Cong, don't actually win their military goals, but they completely catch the US off guard, take all this territory, like totally like have this sort of smashing morale victory, if not like a full strategic victory in the war. And all of these things are reinforcing one on the other. And then you've got people back at home who then start doing bombing attacks on domestic military and ROTC and stuff. And of course, the people of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong who are in the South and the North Vietnamese army for, all the many ways that government, I don't think it's that government would then go on to invade Cambodia and do their own Vietnam, right? Like, so I don't want to, it's not about the government, but the people there on the ground also were fighting under impossible odds and against a genocide, right? If we look at, an example I've already used is the Russian Revolution. That starts from mutinies in the Russian Navy. The big question in the early revolution is like, will we stop fighting? The Russian morale largely collapses. The Eastern Front largely collapses, right? Like before the Bolsheviks take power and end it. We're not going to get into all that. The point is, it's doable. But once the war is on, we're already in a lot of trouble. It's already really bad. So people can end it, and it is by a scaling up of movement stuff that sometimes feels small and that starts small and that like grows. And I think there are, during the coronavirus lockdown, this is a thing that I pay a lot of attention to being a history nerd, is like there were some near mutinies in the US Navy in 2020, right? And in 2025, when Trump came into power, there were worldwide protests against Pete Hegseth by military families. Now, these were pretty small people in the street, with signs, like the kind of protests that are pretty ineffective. But the thing about military families is they live on bases internationally. They are completely dependent on the military. It is extremely risky to put your neck out politically because you can lose your school, your house, your whole life. And so the fact that it's happening at a mass enough scale that there wasn't punishment, morale in the military is bad. Now, does that mean that people aren't flying these missions? Not yet, not as far as we know. Does it mean that the Marines who are currently in the Gulf, like, aren't going to invade if they're told to? Probably not. But all of them are people. Everyone in this, and like, the harder that we push against the war machine, you never know what is going to have a snowball effect. And also, it might not work. I think we were extremely ineffective against the Iraq War in a certain way because, and I think there's been a lot of postmortems on that. But on the other hand, the Iraq War has been defined perennially as unpopular globally as a result of that, of those protests, right? Often it's too soon to tell how things are going to change. And I think, like, speaking to all of these things, plus what you were saying about the sort of leadership wanting to contain stuff, we have really accepted a liberal framing of 2020 that it didn't work and that everyone has left the streets because it didn't work, because people saw that the protest and riot wasn't meaningful, which I think like Minneapolis puts paid to, but I think Los Angeles puts paid to it too. If folks remember earlier in the summer, before there were riots in the streets of Los Angeles for 2 days downtown that were of a scale similar to what we saw in 2014 in Baltimore, one of the earliest Black Lives Matter uprisings. Now, Baltimore was national news for weeks, and the Los Angeles uprising have been memory hold, right? Part of what we're living through right now is an information environment that is totally controlled, right? They bought X, they bought the Washington Post, they bought NBC, they've bought Paramount, like they have total control of the information environment. It's how Trump came back to power, right? Is through the media. There's total control, literal direct right-wing billionaire control of the vast majority of the media, including social media, everywhere up and down the scale, right? From Substack all the way up, right? Whatever. So what they're doing is they're repressing all news of any kind of resistance. And when they have to cover it, they cover it very perfunctorily, and then they move along. And that makes it very hard for us to know what's going on in the rest of the country. But there was a reason that liberal society used to cover stuff like that. And it was because nonprofits would get their headlines, and then they would be able to get their funders, and they would go home. And it was because the people in DC could read the papers and get a sense of what's happening in terms of unrest. So they have blinded themselves, to use an unfortunate ableist metaphor. They have destroyed a major percentage of their own surveillance apparatus in the name of creating a bubble in which they appear unanimously victorious. And so now the conditions of the struggle, similar to the question about legality versus illegality, is can people accept that the stuff that they see on TV, on NPR, in the newspapers, even on social media, can they accept that they just don't have a sense of what's happening, that like this information is bad and false, and act anyway? Like, it seems like the answer is a resounding yes. Like, people are acting. I mean, I've said this every time I've done an interview about the current situation. I was so much more scared on January 19th, 2025 than I have been since, because we were so well set up for a perfect fascist takeover. The stuff about transness had really been proven to be effectively weaponized. The media was totally captured. Biden had successfully counter-revolution 2020 by attacking bodily autonomy through back to work through COVID protocols, which was like an incredibly intricate process that actually, as you were talking about the folks at Deaf Panel, they traced, I think, better than anyone else, certainly who I saw in the English-speaking world. But there was this counter-revolution around that, and there was a Red Scare going about Gaza, right? So they had all of the conditions perfectly set up for a fully compliant population, and instead, what they did was they live for the spectacle, for the image of the fascist boot, right? We learned recently, it was a small story, that Trump gets news on the Iran war through a 2-minute video montage that his advisors make for him. He's literally he's waging war by Instagram sizzle reel. These people are genuinely captured by their own spectacular bubble. And what they have proven is that doesn't make them not dangerous. It doesn't make them incapable of acting, because they successfully were right that spectacle is a large way that politics are managed here. But they also have huge blind spots about resistance. And like any really, really patriarchal abuser who has never faced any consequences, Trump doesn't believe, and his people don't really believe, in the existence of resistance, of continued resistance, of real fight back. And I think they're extremely weak at the exact same moment that they are restarting a global conflict. Like, we might also be in World War III. We might also have already been in World War III for 2 years, since October 8th. I don't know. So I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish at all, but I don't know. That's the situation on the ground. And I think that when regimes collapse, they collapse hard, and it happens fast. And there's any number of ways that a regime collapsing could end a war.
Thank you for diving into that for me. I have so much to chew on. I want to ask you about your new book, but one last question before that I think will be of particular interest to people joining this event. We are living in this time of such intense attacks on trans people, and where the image of trans people and our healthcare and our bodies is so central to the project of racial capitalist ecocidal monsters. I'm curious if you would just talk a bit about trans resistance in this time, and feminist and trans resistance, because I'm part of that is I feel like I witness that people are like, oh, we're totally losing in the realm of law, like just the endless number of bad laws. And there's a way in which in liberalism, you're supposed to feel powerless if you can't get it to happen at the legislature or the court, and we cannot. And so your work shows us that actually that's not the final stop for us, and never has been, and isn't our main arena. And I wonder if you would just talk about that. I know you track this stuff carefully, and you have a perspective that I have found really helpful for understanding where we should be right now, and also what people are doing and what matters.
Yeah, thank you for again another easy question. Is how do trans people solve the problem? But no, I think no, it's really important. Obviously, I'm being cheeky, but well, so I'm going to jump back a little bit to the last decade of resistance that we've seen. Anyone who has participated in social movements over the last 10 years in the United States has witnessed and experienced trans people at the front. We have been at the front lines of every single struggle, not just because I've been part of it and I'm a trans person, so therefore I know, because my egg was cracked by participating in some of those movements. And a lot of people who I know who are trans people now were in the closet when those movements happened, myself included. The experience of movement led a lot of people to transition, but also people who were already trans have been at the front of movements. And I think on the one hand, we do have this massive trans migration going on, which I think is on par with any other major migration that's happened in the United States, largely out of the South and out of the Midwest towards coasts and North. And that has real serious material needs of medical care, housing, money, food that we need to be working on. And that is like the immediacy of the struggle that's going on right now. And that I know is extremely material and immediate. But I feel compelled to answer this question kind of theoretically, whereas I've like been pretty material with the rest of the stuff about movement. Transition, I'm increasingly coming to believe, is a form of abolition. Abolition in its sort of more proper sense, Aufhebung, which is the German, right? Is that right? I'm actually not an academic. Scholar is the only word you can use, so it's nice. But yeah, which is that you destroy and you build. Because as anyone who's transitioned knows, you know, despite what we might say about dead names to try and convince cis people to fucking chill, that we both are not and still are that person. And that both of those are true at once. It is not like someday I'm still that person and someday I'm not. It's like, no, this contradiction, that is a person I am not. And in some ways, I never was that person. And that is my life. And that will always have been who I am, are both true at the same time. This is an extremely radical form of transformation that we take. Now, people who transition don't necessarily have good politics. Shout outs to the Jenners. And it's not innately makes you heroic, but I do think it's notable that even before, long before the attack on trans life became exhaustingly central to politics, we were at the front of all this stuff. And we were at the front of it because we have experienced and understood the messy complexity of what is involved in change. And that if you know something to be true and you will it and you want it to be true, then like you can transform things that seem that the most powerful empire in the history of the world is currently killing itself to try and convince everyone that in fact you're not allowed to change your gender and gender is immutable, right? They are destroying a century of the most effective global power building we have ever seen. And one of the reasons they're doing that is to insist that the gender that accords with your genitals is the only one you're allowed to have. Now, obviously, that's about power over family and over women in general and trans women in particular, and power over children. And it's about controlling bodily autonomy, reasserting whiteness, property, control, and ownership, right? And if your kid can decide one day, actually, you know what, I feel better when I look like this, then you actually don't have the parental power that you're supposed to, because that child's supposed to be your property, right? So there's all these different issues caught up in it. And I don't want to reduce it just to the act of transition simply. But I think that there is a desire for us to make this argument that like trans care is healthcare. That didn't work for abortions. Like we need an affirmative, positive evocation. Abortions rock and transitions are amazing. Like they are a great thing to do with your time. You can do it because you need to, or you can do it because you want to, and you can detransition if you need to, and you can play with your hormones and you can change your body, and you have so much control and so much power, and it gives you the capacity to not only do that with your body and your gender and your social world, but it teaches you that that's possible everywhere, and that terrifies them. It terrifies fascists. It's the scariest thing they can imagine, that in fact, their little kingdoms of car dealerships and hotel businesses and their families with 2 kids and a McMansion is not in fact the sacrosanct end of history. And as they confront crisis after crisis that is ending their world, literally from ecocide to genocide to war, whatever it is, they want control. And they, the Trump administration, one, largely attacked on the vector of race, right? It was very directly about race. And then 2020 happened and defeated them and threw the regime into the street. And, the Democrats were like, well, they should get another chance. We can't prosecute them. We should really give them another chance here. We should we should insult the left, and we should do a counter revolution, and we should treat him like a regular, candidate. And now he's back. But the way he came back and that is thanks to the Democrats. This is the Democrats' regime. This is Biden's regime. Anyway, they're back, and they attacked on the vectors of immigration, which is how they're getting race in, right? And transition. But both of those are about controlling a body, the body politic, the national body, the borders, right? Things need to be really defined. things are one thing only. This is the major theoretical claim of fascism, one of the major theoretical claims of fascism. Things are only one thing. I know that's a vague, weird sentence, but they're very stupid people. And as I started with, what is so beautiful about transition is that you cannot experience transition without knowing that everything is always many contradictory things. And some people forget it, and some people unlearn it, and some, shout outs to the genders, and, whatever. But we do have this experience that could teach us that. And then we have seen over the last 15 years that it has taught so many people that they have been at the forefront of all of these struggles, none of which have named transness as the thing they are fighting for. We have not had a pro-trans movement in this country in a direct way that has hit the streets. There's been stuff, I don't want to downplay the work we've done and the work that I can't talk about, but there's lots of stuff that we're doing that's really for trans people. But the social movements that have captured headlines, that have taken, the country, that have brought it to the brink of revolution, have not been by trans people, but trans people have been in the front lines every single time. And the experience of every social movement has produced more trans people.
I'm in the middle of writing the new edition of Normal Life and reflecting on the last 15 to 20 years since I wrote that book. And it's, bad news on all fronts. Like, things are so much worse even than they were then, except that there's so many more trans and non-binary people. And just in general, people are just getting weirder. And, I always think about how it's like, I hate those discourses about how people are born trans or born gay or born polyamorous or whatever, because I'm just like, no, actually, anyone could do it. It's coming for you. Okay, I want to soon open us up to questions, but I really, really want to ask you about your new book before I take questions from others. So I'm curious if you would just tell us a bit about your new book, about why you wrote it, what you hope it helps people understand. Like, why did you write a book about Disney, and what do we need to know?
I mean, so I'm really proud of the book. I'm really happy with it. I think it's really exciting. I think that it really intervenes in questions about cultural criticism in a way that I'm very proud of. So I want to be really clear about that. I'm also, as I said, I'm not an academic. I was hoping to get like a really big book deal so I could not also work day jobs. And I was like, Disney movies are popular. And people were like, that's that tranny who wrote about looting. We will not give her a contract. So it didn't work out like that, but I'm really happy to be with Anne at Haymarket. Again, like, I think they've done an amazing job. I love the cover. I love the promotion. I love everything about it. So it's not to be ungrateful. Sorry, we got someone. But I also am like a movie girl. It's like one of the things I spend a lot of my time on. It was what I studied in the only time I was at school, an undergraduate. I write about movies a lot. And I think that they, not just movies, but intellectual property and Disney in general, have shaped the world in a really, really fundamental way that I think has gone really underanalyzed, even among the anti-proprietarian left, right? Even among people who critique property. I think there's a reflexive defense of copyright a lot of times you see online because of a lot of small producers, small artists who feel like it's their only defense against a machine that, I mean, even before AI, that just like ruthlessly steals from artists all the time, right? So I think the way that I sort of talk about the stakes, because the book is a history of Disney told through 25 different Disney movies, kind of a little bit, is how I would describe it. And the hook I like to use is like, why are all superhero movies the same? And why did Disney and the rest of the movie industry send lobbyists in 2021 to stop the Biden administration from sharing the coronavirus vaccine with the rest of the world? And why are those answers to those questions the same? Because everyone knows about the superhero stuff. It's no problem. But people are shocked because even people who are pretty cynical about industry know that like COVID was devastating for the movie business, right? Theaters shut. It's extremely expensive to make, like, as people who know about movies know, that like every filming day is so expensive and you need everyone to be on top of it. It's this really, really time-bound process. And if the star of your movie gets COVID, that's 3 weeks that you just lose out of shooting schedule. Like, it's just so important and so expensive. And what people need to know about Disney is that Disney's not in the movie business and largely never has been. Maybe not since 1939, 1940, I would say. And what they're in is they're in the intellectual property business. And other corporations in the intellectual property business include Nike, Philip Morris, Big Pharma is in it. Monsanto, or what are they called now? They got bought out because Monsanto got such a bad rap during Occupy. I can never remember their new name. But, ag tech, most of Facebook, Meta is in the intellectual property business, right? OpenAI is in the intellectual property business. What they own is not actually means of production in the way that we tend to think about it. In fact, what the intellectual property system has done, and I'm so sorry we're so off the topic of where we went, but has done is produced a way for corporations to own the minimal amount of means of production and make the maximum amount of profit. Nike, for example, they maybe own their offices where their executives are, or they probably lease them, right? And then there's a contractor who does their designs, and there's a contractor who sends that design to a contractor in Hong Kong, who then finds another contractor who makes the fabrics, who then ships it to another contractor who then sews them into things. Then there's a truck that's also on a contractor, right? That like takes it in a container to a pre-sold container ship run by, an international crew flagged in the Maldives that like comes around the country. And then like, finally, when the shirt gets to the Nike store, they own the shirt at that point. But like, the janitor who cleans the Nike store also doesn't work for Nike, right? So Nike owns very, very little, which means they have very, very little material costs and they have extreme profit. And the only reason that works, the only way that works is through international systems of law around piracy, around copyright, around trademark and patent. Disney has been somewhat infamous for being a major part of extending copyright law. People know about this sort of reflexively. Copyright used to expire after 28 years when Disney was founded. Now it expires 100 years or 75 years after the death of the creator, meaning that there's functionally no public domain ever, right? Mickey Mouse just came into public domain because Steamboat Willie was released in 1929, right? So like, there's just it's 95 years, right? So like, that ownership and that control is narrativized within Disney movies, and it is reflected in the aesthetics, which is why all the superhero movies look the same because of the intellectual property regime, which I won't get into all of that, but that's what the book's about. But it's fun. I promise every chapter is just like a review of a different Disney movie and how it's actually about corporate policy. And it's just a deep reading of Disney movies that you love and that I love movies. I don't love Disney movies as a whole, but like I am a fan. These movies shaped me too. Right? We were all shaped by Disney if you grew up in America. I mean, not all of us, but a vast majority of us. And the argument is, how were we shaped by a property regime? And how could we imagine a form of art and creativity and culture that gave us more ideas for liberation and for beauty? It's not to deny the power of those things over us. I can't, and I wouldn't want to. But it's to say we deserve better and we can make better, but we do have to reject the property regime.
Yeah, I loved the book. And I have like very low relationship to movies and to Disney, but I found it to be completely compelling. And I know it'll be really amazing for teaching to students and reading groups because people have such strong relationships to these characters and these images. And it's your writing. So it's so compelling and interesting and entertaining and full of stories, just like In Defense of Looting. And so it's a way to wrap our heads around, like, to me, it's like literally about how does the world actually work? Told through Disney. Like in the same way In Defense of Looting is like, how does the world actually work? And that's what I think we all long for because we live under delusions about liberalism and law and order. So it's so important to me. So I want people to start thinking about their questions and putting them in the chat or getting ready to raise their hands. But I want to tell you one more thing before that, Vicky, that's just like really on my mind. I listen to like random charismatic nonfiction books at night sometimes when I can't sleep. And I was listening to one last night and I heard, I'm not going to give you the title because I can't defend this book, so I only hear parts of it while I'm sleeping. But one thing I heard was this part about how research that I never heard of, research looking at like weapons and injury patterns and stuff show that before the Vietnam War, most of the time in wars, people have a very hard time actually killing each other. So even when people are facing each other in the battle, they aim aside, they fire their weapons in ways that are ineffective, that people deeply have a hard time hurting one another. And that because of this research, the United States government in the Vietnam War began to train soldiers differently to really try to change their capacity to hurt other people. And I feel this is like a profound thing, especially because this podcast in many ways is about relationships and resistance and about how we get shaped by dominant systems and how we might reshape social relations and ourselves. And the things you were saying about Minneapolis and the things you were saying about trans people meeting each other in the resistance and being able to comprehend the possibility of transition and your own experience of being influenced to be allowed to transition by people you met in the resistance. I'm just curious if you would speak a bit to this. I feel like this is also central to anarchism and something about how we make the world together and how the very micro of our social relations relates to the possibility of transforming the worst forms of domination. And I just want to hear you speak about that, and then it'll be time for others' questions.
Yeah. I think sometimes I come off as optimistic about possibility. I mean, I think I argue more optimistically for the power of revolutionary struggle than a lot of people do, and popular struggle. And I think I tend to, if anything, overvalue moments of resistance when they happen. But I mean, I don't think it's an overvalue, but I would accept that might be the case, who knows? But I think part of what I've learned from 15 years in direct street level struggle stuff, organizing. Oh God, it's more like 18, 20. Don't tell anyone. Oh, I just set this up. Anyway, there's been this internal process in me, actually. This is quite intimate, I guess, what I'm about to say, but it's 2026. What do you got to lose, other than everything, other than the world, and what we always had to lose. So. In the 2010s, if folks who are older remember, I know you remember this, Dean, there were these series of struggles starting maybe in 2009 with Oscar Grant, but definitely in 2011 with Occupy, where there would be this really big wave of attention and action and activity and organizing, and then it would sort of fall off, right? And it would feel like it had returned to normal. And there was all this despair and all this conflict, and there's a whole book to write about post-movement despair that someone should write about how that so often destroys us. But personally, for me, every time that happened, when the movement was on, I would find myself with so much energy, and I would be in the street, and I would be so active, and I would be meeting people and doing everything every day. I'd be full of passion and excitement. And the meeting would leave the streets, and it'd be a year or two, and I'd be like, oh my God, have I become a reactionary? I just go to work. I don't go to activist demos. I don't do I'm not doing this. And then another moment in my city would become compelling, and then I would again be in the street, and I would be doing all of my energy into it, and I'd be writing, and I'd be so inspired, and I'd be so passionate. I'd be sure we were going to win this time, and I'd be really remembering all the micro histories, and then we would leave the street, and then 18 months would pass, and I go damn, I guess I really I'm liberal now, I'm not really organizing, I'm not part of anything really strong, and then so anyways, you get the picture. And eventually I started to trust myself. I was like, no, when something real needs to happen that I can participate in, I believe that I will answer that call. And part of that believing came from transitioning, and part of transitioning was part of believing that I was capable of that. And those things were, it's chicken and egg, or trans girl and egg, whatever you want to say. And in fact, the way I transitioned was that I was at a trans health festival, a trans health organizing thing that I had come to because I had all these abolitionist comrades who were also trans people. And I was there the second day. Shout out to Action for Trans Health in Manchester, UK. And I was like, it's so funny. I'm the only cis person in this room, but I'm so comfortable. Oh, but again, that whole chain of events, to get me to that moment, was very political, but I was not particularly engaged in queer or feminist politics directly. I was not particularly engaged in trans politics, except for in that sort of moment increasingly, and I found my way to who I was and to the people I wanted to be around through it. And that has changed my life in such deep, profound ways. And in some ways, I've been very lucky to be at the center of sort of big social movements in certain ways, and to have been in the right place at the right time a few times in ways that really changed me. That was powerful. But also, I have learned what I want from life in the process of struggling, and then have learned how to build relationships with people in that process as well. And maybe there are probably easier ways to learn. There are certainly more lucrative ways to live your life financially, but I just know that for myself, and I know what's possible, and I know what kind of transformations are possible. And I've watched it happen to other people, and I've watched how much people can change in the face of being given the opportunity to relate differently. And I think there are very few people on this earth who lack that capacity. Now, unfortunately, a bunch of them are controlling most of the countries right now. It's really a bummer. Some of the least, RFK Jr. probably will never experience human connection and never can. It seems pretty clear. But I think there's hope for almost everyone else, and if we look at the sort of long scope of history, and again, I'm not a Leninist. In fact, I don't like the Bolsheviks, but Lenin in December of 1916, for folks who don't know, the Russian Revolution breaks out February 1917. Lenin is saying in a letter in December 1916, I will never live to see a revolution. right? The guy who's the great prophet of revolution had this fear 2 months before his revolution pops off, right? That's not to like dunk on him. It's just to say that like we have no, because 1905 felt like it. That's where Trotsky, like it was like 1905 was going to be it. And then they got defeated and they're like, that's it, we've lost. History is weirder and more chaotic and more unknown than any of us really want to handle. And I think the reason that I am able to stay and struggle is because I know that uncertainty is beautiful. That uncertainty has produced the sexiest women this world has ever seen. The uncertainty of what is possible has produced the most beautiful music and art and social scenes that have ever existed. Even under the boot of total ecocide and total capitalist control, we continue to live beautiful, strange lives. All of us together, caring for one another, knowing each other, and building networks of resistance and love. And if we can do it, everyone can do it. I'm not that special. I got lucky, like I said, to be in the right place at the right time a few times, but everyone can do that. And I will believe that to the day I die.
I feel it comes through in all of your writing, and so much of In Defense of Looting is these stories about people who really risked everything to do things together, even though they didn't know what was going to happen. And that's the only way we get to do stuff. And that, I think that is what it's like to be trans, is to be like, I'm going to give up everything and accept extreme risk because it's more important to be free than to have things be slightly theoretically more known.
Imagine anyone braver than someone voluntarily and socially transitioning in the year 2026. And yet people are doing it constantly. That's the bravest. I literally can't imagine like a braver choice on some level.
I think it's interesting being my age and seeing how a lot of people are so scared by the legal attacks, and having lived at a time when trans people were so underground and so illegal in a different way. It is it's different to be like everyone's favorite target right now. But I just want people to know that we've always had to take care of each other, and those things were false promises that were barely implemented anyway, Anyway, does anyone have a question for Vicky about any of the things we've discussed or other things, because she is actually an oracle and the answer king? Okay, cool. Here is a question in the chat. I'm going to read it out loud. As an anarcha-feminist media scholar, I frequently struggle with the question of medium specificity in terms of corporate capture/control of specific forms of cultural production, film, video games, etc. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether there's a medium in which representation/imaginative radical thinking can still happen. Or is there a better question to start with? For context, I currently teach media writing and have adjusted my class to cover audio drama because the film industry is so fraught.
Yeah, that's the question, right? Like all of us who do creative work sure hope the answer is yes, right? Whatever field we work in. I think I tend to take an approach and I'm sure you're familiar as a media scholar with, Stuart Hall in his Notes on the Popular, maybe his most famous essay. And this is a paraphrase of his, I'm not quoting him right, where he says, yesterday's revolutionary anthem is today's greatest hit, right? There were people in the Weather Underground who were making bombs to Jefferson Airplane, and that same song now sells cars, right? That's not the fault of the song exactly. It's not exactly the fault of the song. So one of my chapters in the book, not to flog the thing, is about the movie Black Panther, which on its face, politically, is like, wouldn't it be rad if Obama had a perfect technology? Like the happy ending of that movie is that Wakanda opens a charter school on the grounds of a former housing estate in San Francisco, right? Like it could not have been a less liberatory structural narrative in that movie, right? And yet, because of the energy of the actors, of the costume and production design, and because of the energy of audiences that were seeing it at the moment and were confronting it at its moment in 2018 at the nadir of sort of the first Trump administration's seeming control. It was they were at their pinnacle. It was the nadir of hope in some ways when that movie came out. I think like it led to real social movement of a real kind. Like it wasn't phony. Like people in the street were like, Black folks in the street were giving each other the Wakanda greeting, were like organizing stuff. Like there was news about them using this thing, Movie Pass, which people don't remember. It was this app where they like thought they could Uberize movies, but they accidentally just gave us all free movie tickets for a few years before they figured it out. It was really great. And there was this rumor going around, I don't know if it's true, and I didn't have the capacity to do the research on it, that people were just buying tickets with Movie Pass because they were free and filling up screenings of Black Panther, right? Like as like no, obviously that bottom line went to Disney. So that money materially was not in fact going help, but it wasn't real money. It was MoviePass. It was venture capitalist money, not the people who were doing that's money, right? But I think the reason I'm talking about that is that then when Black Panther 2 comes out, it's just another movie. It's just part of the MCU. And the Black Panther franchise successfully added people of color to an extremely white movie universe and gave some cover to it. So like both of those things are happening. And that's obviously the pinnacle of like repressive movie apparatus. So if that can happen with like Black Panther or like The Purge, right? Which was like The Purge was like a big point of reference for folks. I keep talking about 2014 in Baltimore, but it was like a point of reference for them. If movies like that can have those effects, then I think we end up being in a situation where the actual text of the thing, what's happening with franchisization and intellectual property control that you point to, and especially in video games too, in all these places, and pouring these huge amounts of money into these things, is it gives executives a lot more control over the creatives, right? There's a long-standing war of like producers versus creatives in movies, but it's true, it's music companies and producers versus there's artists in the music world, right? There's a similar class struggle internal to our cultural industries, right? And what we're seeing in the current moment is real executive power. They have real control over the image making, over the meaning and the way it is told. And I agree with you that like, if you're going to Hollywood for your politics, like you're going to be sus. Like I like movies with good liberatory politics that do occur sometimes and I'm into them. And also like often I'm reading them against their own grain, or I'm finding what Deleuze in his film studies calls a line of flight, right? Which is a way out of the main sort of meaning that's happening. So is there any particular medium? All of them have the potential depending on the modes of their production. And all of them at the moment have extremely captured modes of production, right? And the video game industry is currently like dying, right? I mean, like largely like it's falling apart. There's sort of 10 AAA games that are forever games, and then everything else is sold like a service game. And anyway, I'm a big believer in medium specificity. I love movies about movies. I love books about books. Like I think it's really interesting and valuable, and it can often lead to more revolutionary or liberatory ways of thinking. By if you look at Peter Watkins' La Commune, which is my favorite movie of all time from 2000, a big part of that movie is all the actors in it talking about what it's like to make a movie together through the process, right? So I love that, and I think it does offer a lot. But no, I don't think there's any medium that is more or less innately repressive, but I do think that the more money it takes to get the product to market, if you will, the more likely it is to bleed out any interesting and revolutionary ideas. And the more DIY you can do it, and of course that's really hard because we're all broke as hell, but the more that you can do it with friends and collectively or without money or both, the more likely you are to be able to do it, whatever the medium is. And I think like, one of the things about movies that's cool is it's really cheap to get a nice shot now. Like, it's tragic that movies look so bad, that like Hollywood movies are so ugly. Like, they're just so ugly now. They're so ugly that people were like, the Barbie movies are revelation. It's like, you just haven't seen saturated color in 15 years. Like, it's not that exciting. But like, there are so many technological and social possibilities, but we're never going to be able to be mainstream with any of it in a real way. And I think embracing doing stuff for your friends and for your community in a local way, as I've gotten older, it's made more and more sense. Like I'm just like, well, like I live in Philly. Like when I was in New York before, people got famous from their writing and their art. It doesn't happen in Philly in the same way, right? Like there aren't the same, sort of career ladders in the same way for creatives. And everyone here is doing more creative stuff all the time, and they're doing it for their friends. And I live a life with more art and creativity in it than I did in New York.
I'm going to share two questions from the chat because I think they're kind of overlapping. So the first one says, for you, how does your day-to-day show up in your relationships, your own sustainability in finishing projects as huge as a book / change work, and overall connection to others? How has that changed for you over time? And what are some of your sticking points in connection to others now during these acute moments, if that feels comfortable to answer? And then I just want to add the second one, wondering if you could talk a bit more about how your intellectual practice is informed by being in movement, and as you mentioned then, by transness, and how this has changed over time. So I think there's maybe some things that are overlapping in both.
Definitely. Wow. Yeah. So the first question, first of all, writing a book is an extremely perverted thing to do. It's a very strange behavior to take up. Any sort of creative project is. That's complimentary. But I am weird, and it is a weird thing to do with your time. So there's that. I think like I've just been doing it for longer. So without being too clear about some stuff I'm still doing right now, I was very involved in Occupy, as I referred to. I was very involved with the 2013, 2014, 2015 Black Lives Matter stuff, in those movements and prison abolition movement. And I got really, really burned by groups of people who I thought were my friends in the wake of certain kinds of drama that happened around politics, like nothing, it wasn't even interpersonal. It was actually about like political differences and stuff. But I got really burned. And then for years, I said to myself and to anyone who would ask, like, I think it's better if your comrades and your friends aren't the same people, right? Like, I had to believe that because I had these sort of social worlds where I was much more comfortable. And then in the political world, I just couldn't trust them. I couldn't trust them. And, and that was horrible. And I think a lot of people have that experience. And I hear some of that in that question. And the project I work on now is the exact opposite. Without saying any more, it's the opposite of that. I am extremely interconnected with the community that I work in politically, socially. In fact, in some ways it feels, even though it didn't start as this, it feels like its strength, its beating heart is the community that we've built together, the small group of core organizers, right? And I think that those would survive the project ending, those relationships now, unless it ended in a really ugly way, which obviously happens, hope, inshallah. So anyways, so for me, it was literally it was a really long process of learning about myself and learning about how I was comfortable and making big choices, like my comrades won't be my best friends. And then seeing where that left me and taking risks and making changes. And my most intimate, relationship, I share it with another writer and organizer revolutionary, and we were always comrades. So it's not quite as clean cut as that. But I think, Dean, you're very right to bring in that second question, because now I'm starting to answer the second question just in trying to answer the first. Very wise of you. That it was precisely in the process of learning how to maintain myself, learning how to maintain these energies, learning how to maintain relationships outside of or alongside creative projects. In the last 3 years, I wrote a book, maintained a full-time job, a few gigs, started CAW, and all of those were easier than helping to run this change project that I work on. We're less time intensive. And that was bananas. And I do not think people should do that. It was too much, but I didn't burn out. And I didn't burn out because I trusted myself and I trusted my friends and I trusted my partner. And when I had to, I took steps back from where I could. And I just trusted that stuff would happen and that it would be there when I needed to come back. And the reason I was able to trust that was the process I described earlier, where I learned about myself that okay, I will, when I have the energy, I'll show up. And I just trusted myself to do that. And do I wish I could have learned that without also having burned out a few times over that decade? Definitely. Those were very expensive ways to learn that. Similarly, transition is a really difficult way and an expensive, quote unquote, expensive, emotionally expensive way to learn some of these lessons. And I wish that that all the suffering that is involved in some of that stuff wasn't necessary for learning it and wasn't a part of it, because it's such a joyous, beautiful thing to do. And it's such a wonderful way to spend your time, transing your gender and your sex, because they're the same or neither exist, however you like it. I'm not going to stake a claim here, please, on this T-Dove. But, I think that, life is a mess of all the things we do and all the relationships we have and all the feelings we have and everything. And things aren't cleanly separate from each other. And I think my skill, Dean has been extremely complimentary. I think my skill in political thought is just able to shift perspective. I think I'm able to see the really micro and the really macro, and to be able to look at them both at the same time without valuing one or the other. And that's cool. That is a very special skill I have. I'm not trying to pretend that that's easy. I know it's not for lots of people. But I think what that has taught me is that everything's too soon to tell. It's too soon to tell what's working. We won't know until long after we're dead whether the things we did in this earth worked. And we know immediately because we know how they make us feel, and we know what happens in our relations, and we know what happens in the world around us in its smallest form. And both of those things are true, even though they're completely contradictory, right? I know at this exact moment that everything I've done up till now has been effective to bring me here. And I have no idea if it will have had a positive effect in the long term. And I can never know it. I can never know whether it has been effective towards the goals I want. Probably. I can probably never know. On some small ones, maybe I'll have a sense, but you understand what I'm saying? Maybe we'll have a big revolution that's really exciting, and I'll be 80 and I'll die the next day. And then the day after that, the counter revolution happens, right? I'll never know. I'll never know, because everything changes. and everything is in flux and it's messy and it's gross and it's weird. But our relationship to ourselves and to other people is the building block. It is the basic unit of all of that. And if you can shift that perspective, you can see that, that meme about the guy with the tiny domino and the giant domino, like if you can see that the tiny domino is like treating yourself and the people around you with love and kindness and respect. And then like the domino is like you become a revolutionary, writing anti-capitalist screeds and then talking to lovely people on podcasts or whatever. I just think that that's a life. I want to live a life of adventure and joy and pleasure and beauty. And this world really doesn't want me to. Me specifically as a Jewish transsexual anarchist, but all of us, it really doesn't want us to live that life. And like, fuck the world. I don't give a shit. I'm going to live a life of beauty and joy and adventure every moment that I can. And the way that I'm going to do that is by making that life available for other people. And I know that that's the most effective way to do it because I've tried a lot of other things. I've just tried stuff. You just got to try stuff. Have ADHD, it works real good. Just try lots of different things. That's been my method. Just try stuff and see what happens. And I don't mean there are no consequences. I don't mean your actions don't matter. I don't mean, to de-responsibilize or whatever. I'm not trying to be over romantic about, you can't just do whatever you want and like that, whatever. But like, also, if you make a mistake, you are alive the next day still. Hopefully the mistake's not so bad. And like, you have to live with it. And like, you can either deny that it happened or you can try to learn from it. And like, the longer you try to learn from your experiences and the longer you try to have new experiences, or you try to have old experiences you love, and you don't beat yourself up for doing the same thing again, because that can be it too. Sometimes you gotta just trust yourself that you want to just sit and watch your favorite TV show again and brain rot. Like, sometimes that's what you need to do because looking outside is too hard. Like whatever it is, meeting the world with compassion and kindness and generosity and curiosity. I don't know. I think you pretty quick end up being like, yeah, we should burn this motherfucker down. I think you end up in a, like, I think what's really scary for them is that like love, compassion, kindness, and generosity is what makes me think that looting is like a really effective tactic and that we should like riot and destroy property, and that's going to be a necessary part of us finding freedom.
I think probably like when I'm hearing you talk, and this was so beautiful, I'm thinking about how every time I see you, you give me all these incredibly cute and funny stickers that you've made. And to me, this is just a broader part of your practice, which is that like things should be cute and fun and sparkly and funny. And this thing you're saying, is the center of what this podcast is about and what my work is about so often, which is just like things are objectively horrible. Like the conditions are really, really bad and scary. And doing the work on them is hard. It's just hard. People are difficult. We're imperfect. We make mistakes. We lack solidarity. We have conflicts. We have to do things like late at night and early in the morning. All of it's hard. And all we can do is like try to orient where possible our relationship to it. And I just love what you said about doing all the work you're doing and not being burnt out by it, even though in the past you've experienced burnout. Because what I believe is that burnout primarily comes from unresolved conflict and pain and disappointment and betrayal feelings with whoever we were working with, and cultivating resentment, which is what I've been doing workshops about lately. Like resentment is like a really reasonable response that people have to living under coercive conditions and experiencing lack of solidarity. And when we cultivate it, we get poisoned in ourselves. So we have to find ways to digest the grief of all the disappointments and betrayals and still orient towards possibility, what's fun. Oh, actually, I think I want to orient to a different tactic that excites me more right now, even though I've done this other one and been known to doing it for a long time, because we don't know what's going to work. And we have to somehow keep and build and grow capacities to like trust ourselves and other people, even though everybody fucks up all the time. And we've been trained to believe everybody's greedy and bad and dangerous to us and that we should, isolate and individuate. It's just like, it's so deep what you're saying about how to maintain capacity to engage without pretending things are other than they are, and I think that so often people just ask me, how are we supposed to resist when we have to pay these outrageous rents that are the highest they've ever been and food prices are the highest they've ever been and gas prices? Like the conditions are real, and yet resistance is our only option, and it makes your life better for all the reasons you said. Like you might meet people who blow your mind and like are really fun to have sex with and are like wonderful friends and like change the way you think about things, and also who betray you and disappoint you and who expose to you that you've made huge mistakes that you didn't realize. And then that's really hard to face. Like Anyway, I just really appreciate you ending on this note because I feel like it's a question a lot of people are deeply asking themselves, especially trans people who are living with the level of threat and fear that, is currently alive. Is there anything you want to say to conclude, Vicky?
No, I mean, I just think that like that's the question is everyday life. Is like, how do you want to live? And that doesn't just mean in the future. It means right now. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Thank you so much to CLAGS for having me here. This has been really lovely. And I actually really needed this today. As Dean knows, I was having a rough one up until now, and I feel great because talking to you, Dean, always makes me feel great. So thank you so much.
I feel the same way. It's just so moved by the decades of work of CLAGS to produce spaces of conversations that are so far beyond academia, so relevant to people's day-to-day resistance. Like, I really hope everybody can support CLAGS' ongoing work and get involved with CLAGS events. And yeah, I'm really grateful to you, Vicky, for all of your relentless generosity to all of us, and so excited to celebrate your new book.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you so much to Vicky Osterweil for having this conversation with me, and to CLAGS for hosting this live recording. Special thanks to Maddie and Jasmina for this collaboration. Thank you for joining me for the latest episode of Love in a Fucked Up World. This podcast is based on my book of the same name, which is out now from Algonquin Press. I hope you'll pick it up from an independent bookstore in your community and not from Amazon or Audible. Love in a Fucked Up World is hosted by me, Dean Spade. It is produced and edited by Hope Dector. Our creative director is Ciro Carrillo. Thank you to Eugene, Derek, Kelsey, Lindsay, Jessica, Raindrop, Nicole, and everyone else who helped with this podcast. Our theme music is I've Been Wondering by The Ballet. We need each other now more than ever, and I hope this podcast offers tools and ideas that can help us build and sustain strong relationships and strong movements. I hope you'll keep listening, subscribe, and share this episode with the people in your life.